Going. This is the lecture for Monday, the 22nd of October. Why do I keep saying October? I've done this like 20 times over the last few weeks. It's March, the 22nd of March, 2021. This is for European history. Now, what we've just done is taken the quiz for Baker 27, which you should take if you're at home. And we've also seen videos for Sabaton's Attack of the Dead Men, about poison gas, which we'll talk about in a moment. And if you would summarize those insights you just gave again, for the sake of that, that would be good. And we also saw two versions of Boney's Ra Rasputin. So, we start with poison gas.
So so the Germans, they like gassed the place for like a couple days. I don't even think it was one. They used a lot of gas.
They used a lot of gas.
And like almost they thought that every single Russian had died because there was no gunshots and there was no like they were completely quiet. And then when the Germans marched in, there was an entire battalion or four of Russians coughing up bits of their lung and blood with bayonets charging at them.
20th century men, far above superstition, ran away like schoolgirls. No offense to you schoolgirls, but no, they ran because that's scary. It really happened. One of the commanders who commanded that particular unit had some notion of poison gas and of chemistry, and he orders his men to wrap themselves up like mummies, and that protected them enough so that they survived to attack. They did not survive the battle, let's be clear. They did die. But before they died, they earned what can only be described as amazing glory by staying alive until the Germans came in and then they went at them with the bayonet, which is something that, even under the best of circumstance, takes guts because bayonets involve close and hand-to-hand fighting, and that is going to always be dangerous and bloody and intimate. So, regarding poison gas, chlorine gas was used in the attack on Auschwitz Fortress. It's also the primary gas that was used for most of World War I, which works by you inhale it and it literally liquefies your lungs slowly, turning them into bloody masses that don't process oxygen into the bloodstream. It's a pretty slow, nasty, horrible, painful way to die. But that isn't good enough. Mustard gas was developed by the war's end, and it was used. And mustard gas is an airborne acid. It doesn't require you to breathe it in. It is a blistering agent. If any of your skin is exposed, it will literally melt your skin clean off if there's enough of it. Now, a few things about poison gas in general terms. First, the world suspected that they had a doomsday weapon. And after the First World War, there are a series of science fiction stories, some of which are very serious and philosophical. Last and First Men by Olaf Stapledon, for example. H.G. Wells' The Shape of Things to Come. And these stories involved a Second World War where the war would commence with great air fleets taking off as war was declared, passing each other in a somber moment, saluting each other on their way by one another, these massive bomber fleets as they headed to all of the enemy's major cities and just dumped mustard gas on them until no one was left alive. Now, this wouldn't destroy the world like later thermonuclear weapons would, like hydrogen bombs would, but it would certainly destroy human civilization. Gone. There it goes. Some rural people would be left, but the cities would be charnel houses, haunted by the spirits of the dead in the minds of those who lived. They even developed infant respirators, so that one of the things that people had in London in World War II, in case the Germans came with more than explosive ordnance, was these little cylinders that you'd put a baby in, and you'd have to manually breathe for it, and that manual bellows action would bring air in and cleanse it with the filters. Now, how long those filters would have lasted under protracted mustard gas attacks, anyone's guess. In fact, would those filters have stood up against mustard gas, which can also degrade materials? Would have worked probably against chlorine. Now, there were conventions against the use of poison gas from the 1920s. But then again, there's a treaty outlawing war from the 1920s, which we'll get to. Yep, war was outlawed before the Great Depression, so we have nothing to worry about because it's against the law. Why wasn't poison gas used in World War II? Why did Hitler choose to swallow his Walther P-38 rather than deploy it? Why did the Japanese not deploy it? This is one of those things that helps me believe that the hand of God does have something to do with history. In 1918, summer of, Hitler is gassed personally. When he gets gassed, Germany has failed in the St. Michael offensive, but it's still in a very strong position vis-a-vis the Allies. He almost dies. He almost kills himself. But eventually recovers. But the world he is recovering into has changed. It's really after Germany signs the armistice and is in the process of accepting the Treaty of Versailles that Hitler really comes to terms with his new life. And it sucks. Everything he fought for in the trenches for 4 straight years was given up. There's an anger in him. But the experience of breathing poison gas may have saved the world. His experience was such a life changer, he never used it. Never. He chose to kill himself rather than use it. Now, there was a mutually assured destruction element to gas warfare. There's a reason why countries have supplies of poison gas. Because if somebody uses on us, we're going to kill them. Mutually assured destruction. Saddam Hussein and the Iranians were the first people to use poison gas on the battlefields after World War I in their Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. So we're talking 60 years or more between the uses in 1918 and then the uses in 1982. But after the Iran-Iraq War, after both sides used chemical weapons, not only on each other's troops, but on each other's cities, delivered this time by ballistic missile. When we fought Saddam after he invaded Kuwait, he never used poison gas on us. And there's a reason. Because we let it be known very clearly that if he used poison gas on us, we'd nuke him. It was done quietly. But we would not respond nicely, and we would not respond in a civilized fashion. We make it very clear that if you use WMDs against American forces or people, we will hit you as hard as we possibly can. And that fear has helped keep the peace, and it's also helped keep the use of poison gas from being employed against us. The Iranians used them against the Iraqis used them against the Iranians. The next time poison gas was used by the Syrians, their Russian puppet government of Bashir Assad in 2011 and 2012. President Obama, after the first attack, where the Syrian military loyal to the Alawite faction that was ruling in Russia's name, there's a lot to unpack there in that statement, but to try to explain the background. The military loyal to Bashir Assad had gassed civilians. They had also employed helicopter gunships and napalm against peaceful protesters. So President Obama said that future use of poison gas would be a red line, implying that we would get involved if it was used. It was used. We did nothing. It was used again. We did nothing. So, at least for the duration of his administration, the notion of an American president drawing a red line didn't seem to make much sense. It did not have much of a deterrence effect. In fact, after Barack Obama refused to enforce the red line, the Syrian civil war got much worse. So, the only other time poison gas has been used en masse against human beings was during Hitler's final solution to the Jewish question. And we will talk extensively about that. But we still have stockpiles of poison gas. We've upgraded from mustard gas to nerve gas. A Japanese terror group called Amshan Rikyu in the 1990s discharged nerve gas, sarin gas, into the subways of Tokyo. And nerve gas, much more effective than chlorine, much more effective even than mustard gas. It literally attacks the central nervous system, and if you get it, you're dead. Nasty stuff. We have it, the Russians have it, the Chinese have it. Every major power has stockpiles of the stuff because we want to be able to retaliate if somebody uses it on us. And with the exception of those times in the Middle East I told you about, and that Japanese terror group, thank God it hasn't been used. So the nightmare scenario of World War II didn't happen. Instead, Hitler kills himself. Saddam Hussein allows himself to be trapped in a spider hole rather than use it against American forces when they invade in Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003. So thus far, we've been lucky that poison gas has not been used in a large way. My wife's best friend when we lived in Portland, Maine, a woman named Gamri, is Kurdish American. The Kurds are a people from the borderlands of Iraq, Iran, and Turkey. And all three of those countries have systematically partitioned Kurdistan for as long as anyone can remember. But the Kurdish people retain stubbornly, like the Poles did under the Germans, Austrians, and Russians, a sense of national identity. Gamri saw Saddam's forces hit her village, which was in northwestern Iran, with mustard gas. She herself suffered damage. She wasn't killed, but she has a permanently reduced lung function because of it. No, it was chlorine gas, not mustard gas. Her village was temporarily occupied by the Fedayeen Saddam, who were the Iraqi shock troops of that war. And when they arrived in her village, they gathered all the people, they separated out the men, and they executed a few just as an attention getter. Her oldest brother was the first guy they shot. She managed to come to this country legally and became an assistant librarian working with my wife at Portland High School. So this stuff, even though it hasn't happened on a large scale, still does happen, unfortunately, and it's quite real. Any thoughts, questions, comments about the poison gas thing before we move on? Okay. We'll talk about Rasputin later. Britain's an island. Germany cannot hope to compete, even with its high seas fleet, with the British Grand Fleet. They try. Every time they fail. At the battles of Doggerbank and later Jutland, the German fleet's plan is to trap part of the British fleet, isolate it, and destroy it. On both occasions, the whole British fleet's at sea and surprises the Germans. And while the Germans sink more British ships, the British have more ships to begin with. The British maintain a blockade of Germany, which, as you know, is going to lead to food riots and the overthrow of the German government. Ultimately, the peace. However, Britain is an island. And the Germans understand that as an island with about 45 million people in those days, Britain can't feed itself. If every acre of land that was arable was used for farming in the most efficient way possible, tens of millions of Britons would still starve. They've got to import ridiculous amounts of foodstuffs every single day, or Britain will starve. The Germans know this. So they employ a new weapon, the Unterseeboot, the submarine, to blockade Britain. It was in the service of this blockade that the RMS Lusitania was sunk off the old Head of Kinsale in southern Ireland in 1915. Now, at first, submarines would surface. They would warn the British merchantmen to evacuate, giving them, say, 10 minutes. That's enough time for the British to destroy their code books and get any civilians off into lifeboats and get away, and then the Germans would sink the British merchant ship with shell fire from their deck gun. However, the British compensate for this. They build what are called Q ships. Q ships, Q as in the letter Q, not a Q stick. Q ships look like merchant ships, but they have dozens of hidden guns on them. When a submarine surfaces, the British unmask their guns, and outgunning the submarine, they sink it. The Germans learn about this. So they decide that instead of giving warning, they're going to sink civilian merchantmen like they sink warships. Early in war, 1914, 3 obsolete British armored cruisers, the Hogue, the Abukir, and the Cressy, were sunk in one afternoon by a single German submarine. The first of them was torpedoed and sank. The other 2, which were sailing with it, stopped to rescue survivors, and they were sank as they were stopped. All 3 ships went to the bottom that day, and the German submarine commander became a bit of a hero in Germany. Well, the Germans are now going to do this to British civilian ships and to any other civilian ships going to Britain. This is, of course, bloody-minded business. There's no warning. There you are, sailing along, steaming along, minding your own, and suddenly you have a hole blown into you by Torpex, torpedo explosive, and your ship may go down, you may explode, you may die in fire. The notion of civilians being protected from war continues to be eroded. With unrestricted submarine warfare comes British organizing ships into convoys, which are herds of ships like sheep, guarded by dogs, sheepdogs. And those sheepdogs are small warships called corvettes and destroyers. And these corvettes and destroyers would escort the ships across the sea, and if a submarine attacked, they would hit it with what are called depth charges. Imagine an ash can filled with explosives with a pressure gauge near the firing pin. When it gets to a predetermined depth, it explodes. Now, the depth charge itself was not intended to destroy the submarine. The concussive effect through a medium as thick as water, you blow up a grenade in the air, it's going to do a bit of damage. You don't want to be near it, you don't want to have shrapnel hit you. The concussion, though, isn't that bad. If you ever watch real training videos on YouTube using grenades, they're not as impressive as they are in movies. However, you drop a grenade into the water, and it's going to kill lots of fish, because the water is so much denser. When the concussion wave goes out, it is far more destructive. So, depth charges can sink submarines. And this helps Britain win the war against the U-boats in World War I, but it was a pretty close-run thing. Also, U-boats are going to be instrumental in getting the United States involved in the war. The First Air War. The average life expectancy of a fighter pilot on the Western Front in World War I was 2 weeks. That means half of the pilots that go into combat die within the first 2 weeks.
My granddad, he had a friend in the Vietnam and Korea era.
Yeah.
And when the draft happened, he was like really, really scared because his friend had a birthday that was literally the day before his, and his friends got drafted and he didn't.
Wow.
So it was like right on the line, like he was the next person. But he ended up enlisting anyways. But if he were to be drafted, he would have been a Vietnam helicopter pilot, which has a life expectancy of 30 seconds in the air.
Being a Vietnam helicopter, I've never heard that statistic. I'm not disbelieving you, but it's a dangerous job. The ones who survived were really incredible pilots. My mom, when she was a police detective, used to go flying, and the pilot of the police helicopter, the helicopter they rented, was an old Vietnam guy. So what he would do is when he was taking new people up, he'd like buzz trees and do aerobatic maneuvers just to see how scared he could get them because he had a sick sense of humor. But also because he got away with doing that stuff, he needed to do that stuff in combat to avoid getting shot down. God bless. Did they make it? I hope.
Oh yeah, he enlisted in like computer coding basically.
Oh, okay.
So he basically went into the Coast Guard instead of.
Okay. Yeah, volunteering also allows you to choose your service. So you can choose to be with the Marines, who are very tough, or you could choose to be in the Coast Guard or the Air National Guard, like President Bush, the second Bush. But if you get drafted into the Army, you're going to combat in Vietnam. Um, anyway, in the air, it starts out, and I told this story a little bit. It starts out as scouting. The scouts eventually start throwing rocks and grenades, and eventually they start fighting one another. In the air bombing, Zeppelins and later bombers bomb London, bomb Paris. So again, imagine this. You're from a civilized society, and your job is to ride your air vessel, whether it's a big dirigible or a bomber aircraft, and drop your bombs on a city filled with men, women, and children. The distinction between civilian and warrior has been erased by 1916. World War I is a total war. No mercy, no quarter. You defeat the enemy by killing their people. If you kill their civilians, this should interfere with their industrial output. If you destroy factories or the workers' homes who work in those factories, you destroy the enemies or damage the enemy's industrial output. Anything is acceptable in the name of victory. And with this, anything is acceptable in the name of victory, ends justifies the means notion. That, on top of the bloody mess that is the trenches, turns European Western civilization's assumption of its own civilization on its head. The Europeans are never going to again just blithely assume that Western civilization is superior without thinking about it, without having to justify it. Because Western civilization is capable of gassing people, is capable of bombing people, is capable of torpedoing people, and is capable of sending its best young men in human wave attacks against enemy machine guns, gambling that they have more chests than the enemy has bullets. Next time, we will talk about the wider war outside of Europe, and I expect that you will have a quiz or a section of a unit exam on Wednesday or Thursday. At this point, I'd say Wednesday is likely. So be ready for that. You may talk quietly amongst yourselves until dismissal. Those of you at home, don't forget to do your quiz and see the other videos. Thank you.